This is Milton Keynes, a thriving multicultural city of over 250,000 people. Yet 50 years ago, the site was largely occupied by farmers' fields where crops were grown and cattle grazed. Just how and why did this agricultural area of North Bucks get transformed into the largest and most ambitious of Britain's new towns? This is a story of Milton Keynes' early years, told by those who were part of the Development Corporation tasked with its planning and development. It's a story of audacity and brashness, of teamwork and tussles, of utopian dreams and a bold vision.
Beautiful name for a lovely village, almost the smallest in England. In the local, they said it must have been some big official with a sense of humour, surely a contradiction in terms, who chose this name for the projected new town of 250,000 people.
On the 23rd of January 1967, the Labour Minister of Housing and Local Government, Tony Greenwood, announced the designation of around 22,000 acres of North Buckinghamshire countryside as the site for what turned out to be the biggest of Britain's new town developments. But this was not the first plan to develop a new city in North Bucks. The year is 1961. Stranger on the Shore tops the hit parade. Yuri Gagarin is the first man in space. John F. Kennedy is sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. And the Beatles perform for the first time at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. In that same year, Fred Pooley, the chief architect of the Buckinghamshire County Council, takes on an additional role as chief planner. He had been appointed chief architect 7 years earlier at the young age of 38, having worked previously rebuilding war-damaged Coventry.
There was enormous pressure on the council, the Bucks County Council, for planning permissions of all kinds within the Green Belt and in the south of the county around Slough at the time. And Fred Pooley said, "I'm fed up with saying no. I want to, as a positive architect planner, to say yes." And so I think he got the idea of creating a new city. I was called into Fred's office and he literally said to me, what would be the implications of building a new city for 250,000 people in North Bucks? About why 250,000? He said, well, I really enjoyed Coventry and 250,000 seems to be a pretty good size for a city. Oh, he did say a city based on public transport. He did say that. And for the public transport, he had mentioned a monorail.
Fred Pooley and the County Council knew the government was about to publish their South East study, which was to suggest a new city in the Bletchley area. In January 1964, they jumped the gun and held a news conference in London and invited the press and broadcasters to attend.
Here is the 8 o'clock news for today, Tuesday the 7th of January, read by John Spurling. Official planners in Buckinghamshire want to build a new type of city for the motor age, in which no one would live more than 10 minutes' walk from a school or a free monorail service may one day be built in Buckinghamshire near Aylesbury. The planners see the cost of the monorail service, an attractive alternative to travel by car, being paid for out of the rates.
The North Bucks New City project ended up being called Pooleyville after Fred Pooley. And in order for the county council to develop the project, it needed financial guarantees from the government. The monorail was too expensive to build all at once, and the government simply wasn't prepared to underwrite the risks of developing this highly innovative, quite speculative scheme. But the government liked the idea of a new city in North Buckinghamshire, it would fit in the regional plan to be published shortly. And so it decided to use the New Towns Act to set up a development corporation to invest public money and take the risk that that public money would be repaid.
In January 1967, when the Minister of Housing and Local Government made the announcement to create a development corporation for Milton Keynes, he also announced that its chairman would be Lord Campbell of Escan. He was an inspired choice, a man of great determination and compassion. Aged 55, he had just stepped down as chairman of the family business, Booker McConnell, whose wealth was based on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Jock Campbell was also a member of the Labour Party. He knew his way round Whitehall, and as an old Etonian had many acquaintances in the Conservative Party too.
The BBC wanted me to do a recording on the evening of the day my appointment was announced. And I started by talking about it as Milton Keynes. And the BBC man who knows, I was saying I knew nothing about it. They said, you know so little about it, you don't even know how to pronounce it.
Jock Campbell appointed Walter Ismay as the Development Corporation's deputy chairman and first chief executive. Ismay, amazingly, had no new town building experience, but the team began to be assembled. One of the first things Jock Campbell and his board had to do was to draw up a brief for the appointment of a master planner. County council members of the board put great pressure on him to go with Fred Pooley's plan. But when it came to choose a master planner, Jock Campbell had someone else he knew in mind, Richard Llewellyn Davies. He was also a member of the Labour Party, and the two had met to talk about Milton Keynes several times.
That's what we had the decision of who to appoint as the master planners. And I was always intended that we should appoint Llewellyn Davies, but I knew him and he was, he had very open ideas, and we very much agreed about things. But the ministry made us go through a tremendous business of asking 4 people to make presentations. In the end, everybody chose Llewellyn Davies.
Llewellyn Davies' practice was appointed because Llewellyn Davies and Jock Campbell knew each other from a long time ago. But the preparation of the plan was done by Walter Bohr and John de Monchaux. Fred Pooley was also appointed as a special advisor by the MKDC board, but it was very clear from the outset that the Llewellyn Davies team had no respect or interest in promoting a monorail. Llewellyn Davies had just finished the master plan for Washington Newtown, which, incidentally, also featured a grid road system.
The master planners were appointed in 1967. They did not deliver their final master plan until 1970, but they did produce, as they had intended, an interim report in October 1968. This laid out the bare bones of the plan and included a recommendation that the first development should take place in a crescent that linked the existing towns of Wolverton and Bletchley. This enabled the acquisition of land for development to begin, with landowners receiving compensation. Within 5 years, the Development Corporation had acquired 12,600 acres of land, 2/3 of that required, at an average cost of £840 per acre.
When I was training to be a surveyor, I worked for some of my time in the docklands of Cardiff City, Tiger Bay. The living conditions that people had were absolutely appalling and unbelievable. I recall going into one house. It was 2 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms upstairs. The back ground floor room had a solid earth floor. The only water supply was in a dripping tap in the backyard. Now that was the sort of standard accommodation people had. I saw a job advertised with this new development corporation in Milton Keynes. That was in 1969, and I moved in June of that year. I was responsible primarily for buying the land on which the city was built. I eventually lived in Woughton-on-the-Green, and our second compulsory purchase order was in Woughton-on-the-Green. And I used to visit the village pub. I was in there one evening, early evening, and this young man came in, and he was complaining bitterly about this person, Brookman, who was throwing his farmer off on the streets. He didn't know who I was, but he'd like to find out, he'd like to meet this man. Of course, the pub went extremely quiet, and everybody looked at me. So I said, I'm Brian Brookman. He said, how can you possibly do... So I told him the story about the house I saw in Tiger Bay. I said, now, if I have to make a choice, I said, remember that every acre of land we buy will have, on average, 8 homes, maybe up to 15, depending on the price range. Rented accommodation, probably 15 homes. If I have to choose between a farmer and the hundreds and thousands of people who are living in London in the sort of conditions I've just described and getting them a decent home, I will buy that farmland every time. The farmer will lose the argument every time. The accommodation that people live in is appalling, and I want to be part of doing something about it. He said, well, I didn't think of it like that. That was the end of the conversation.
The creation of the new city's infrastructure did not just involve work above ground on roads, but underground too, with the creation of drainage and sewage tunnels.
The tunnel miners, they were a hardy breed and a bit of a law unto themselves. I got on all right with them. I can recall one incident where I was down a shaft, an open excavation, with one of the contractor's men, because we had to measure up anywhere where there was rock, because the tunnel miners got paid extra for rock. It took them longer and it was harder work. I was down this shaft, which was about 5 metres down, and I was trying to argue that it was not rock. It was hard soil, but it wasn't rock. The tunnel miner got a bit aggrieved. He took his pickaxe and brought it down with all his might, and sparks flew off. He said, look at that, sir. That's fierce hard. So I said, okay, that's rock.
Today's users of the city's grid roads are accustomed to driving along them at speeds of up to 70 miles an hour, but that was not what the master planners had originally intended.
We felt that 40 miles an hour was the appropriate speed. We had the Bucks County Council saying that in the immediate time before there are any houses there, to some extent quite correctly, there'll be no justification for having a 40 mile an hour road, and so they said it should be built to 50 miles an hour. And then these super principal roads, which connected up to the trunk road system and the motorway system, we should have roads which were built to a higher speed. At no stage did we anticipate 70 miles an hour.
In terms of the grid roads, there is one feature that Milton Keynes is famed for now, which was not mentioned in the original master plan: roundabouts.
The master plan was done principally from the point of view that all the crossroads will be controlled by traffic lights. Now that's all very well if you have constant traffic. If you can imagine having not much development and lots of junctions with traffic lights, the potential for fatal accidents was very high. And that's why I think it was David Jameson who made the decision to put roundabouts in.
David Jameson, the corporation's chief engineer, might have wanted to put in roundabouts, but it was actually not the corporation's decision. It was the county council who were responsible for the roads once built. They decided to treat the city grid roads in their early days as rural roads, and rural roads didn't have traffic signals.
They were of a temporary nature, but they've become permanent, and Milton Keynes is almost known for its roundabouts.
In March 1970, after nearly 3 years of intense arguments and discussions that delayed its completion, the master plan for Milton Keynes was presented to the government.
Looking back 50 years later, I think there are 4 significant features of the plan for Milton Keynes. First, the grid road system. The grid road system was built by and large as originally envisaged. It was to enable congestion-free private motoring. But the idea, Fred Pooley's idea of mobility for all, was lost. Even today, half of the city's population don't have access to a car during the day. Second main feature is the low density overall for the city and the parks, leaving enough space for a true garden city to be created. And that's what's been delivered as well. The third main feature is social balance and social development. In contrast with the earlier new towns, Milton Keynes was going to be a city for everybody, not just working class households, but wealthier households and poorer households. That's been achieved, as has been the investment in social development to enable communities to grow and prosper. Finally, the fourth important feature of the plan was that it was a strategic plan, not a detailed plan, leaving it to others over the last 50 years, the next 50 years and beyond, others to fill in the details.
In 1969, Jock Campbell used his contacts book and his skill as a chairman to bring an institution to Milton Keynes that has made its name and that of Milton Keynes known throughout the world.
I remember incidentally one board thing, which I'm slightly ashamed of. This is about the Open University, which was a political subject. And I was going to Geoffrey Crowther, as chairman of Trust House 40, to try to get them to build the first hotel in Milton Keynes. But I was reading my Times in the taxi on the way to see him, and I saw that Geoffrey Crowther had been made the first chancellor of the Open University. I mean, I'd known him on and off for years. So I said, right, I was going to talk to him about a hotel. I'm now going to talk to him about a university. So I read this in the Times. Why shouldn't the Open University come to Milton Keynes? There's never been a new university in a new town, and this seems all wrong. Milton Keynes is the one to do it with, and it's very important. It was very important to us. And so eventually this worked, and we got it. And we gave them a prime site on very reasonable terms. And when I got the board meeting, I couldn't get agreement on it because all the Tory members of the board, it was just before the change of government. And the majority of the board said no, they wouldn't agree to use this prime site when there was soon going to be a Conservative government. And they said openly, as a matter of policy, they weren't going to support the Open University. So I was getting very stuck on this, and I looked as if I could have had a vote, which I would have lost. So I suddenly had a bright idea, and I said, well, now, Edward Boyle, who was Vice-Chancellor of Leeds, is a great friend of mine. Give me 10 minutes, I'll go ring up Edward Boyle. And as he's been Tory Shadow Minister of Education, would you go along with him? So I went up to my room, I rang Edward Boyle. By surprising, I got him. Edward, this is Jock. I got a problem at Milton Keynes. Told him what the problem was. He said, the bloody awful place. I'm suggesting every don who consults me, every academic, not to get a job. It won't last under Conservative government.
Jock Campbell returned to the board meeting, told them he couldn't get hold of Edward Boyle, and then argued through his proposal successfully.
I'm now talking about 1970, so it was 3 years. The plan had been produced just and acknowledged, agreed. I think the inquiry had happened, the public inquiry, and people were anxious to get things on the ground. And it wasn't happening.
Walter Ismay was one of the most modest, delightful men as possible, or saintly man. In the planning stage, I think our relationships with farmers, our relationships with the people, relationships with people round about, with the press and all this, were very much due to Walter Ismay's patience and forbearance and charm. But when it came to starting to implement the plan, he couldn't do unpopular things. In fact, he found it difficult to take difficult decisions, which is difficult.
In order to resolve this situation, Jock Campbell turned to a man who was making a reputation for himself in Runcorn Newtown as someone who could deliver development at a fast pace, Fred Roach.
All new towns run into a crisis about year 3. This is because they spent 3 years buying land and putting in drains and things like that. And government don't want that. They want, where is it all? Where's the industry? Where's the housing? And so there's usually a bit of a crisis year 3, year 4. And it happened with Milton Keynes. Fred had performed unbelievably speedily at Runcorn. And I think it was the government that decided, Jock, this is the chap you're going to have.
Fred got summoned down to Milton Keynes and was asked whether he'd like the job of Director of Design and Development, which was there was a general manager, I think he was called a managing director, Walter Ismay, but this was a post immediately under him, over everything else, Director of Design and Development. Within 12 months, Ismay had gone, Fred was general manager, but he didn't like handling the detail of management. In fact, he hated it. And he had to have his, if you want to call henchmen around, to shoulder all that stuff. And of course his prize henchman was Frank Henshaw. And he looked to me on the landscape side to manage that, so that he would declare, we want the City of Trees in Milton Keynes. Are you up for it, Brian? Yeah, I'm up for it. Right, we go for it then.
Milton Keynes did indeed become a city of trees, but in these early years the pressure was on building houses.
You had huge pressure to get housing built. Government really was not very happy about lack of progress in Milton Keynes at that stage. There was also the move towards industrialised building methods in housing, which meant that you were looking to large numbers, and you had the third big factor, that the private house market had just disappeared. The private builders had gone. And we had to, when you're making promises to incoming companies and their staff and so on, that if they come to Milton Keynes they will be housed, you had to produce houses. So those pressures all contributed to gearing up for big scale production in quick time.
The man Fred Roach chose to take over his role as chief architect and planner to provide some design leadership was Derek Walker, whose private architectural practice he'd become familiar with while working in Runcorn.
It was my job to recruit a team of my choice and put that team together in order to design all the major strategic ideas for the city. The way the city should look, the landscape quality. The idea, I guess, was to generate excitement, not with just the architects and planners and landscape architects who were working with me, but also the engineers and the other members of staff.
Derek was immensely successful at drawing in talent. He really was. He drew in talent from all over the shop. They didn't always get on with one another, but they were very talented people. He was also very good at publicity. A lot of it was self-publicity, nevertheless, Milton Keynes benefited.
The story behind Netherfield was quite interesting because there were 4 guys who I knew vaguely, and they'd done an interesting competition a couple of years previously, which had not won the first prize but had really got the second prize.
Isn't this Runcorn?
And I went to see them and talked them into coming to Milton Keynes. They were, typical AA students, Architectural Association students. They were, pretty arrogant, rather charming. But they were talented. They were very, very talented. And so I said, look, I want you guys to work on Netherfield, which is going to be one of the key early housing areas, at 1,500 houses, undulating site.
We had a saying in housing management throughout the years that if you never heard anything about an estate, it was okay. If you heard something about an estate, you were in trouble. There was this pressure to build quickly. And one of the attractions that was being put to the board was that the best way to build quickly was to build in a non-traditional manner. And this almost became a tide. I even got to the stage at one time where I'd lost my argument about the flat roofs always leak sooner or later, and had to start use stupid arguments like, well, people will cycle over flat roofs. It showed you how desperate I was, really.
And the board, after some deliberation, said, we've got to get Milton Keynes underway. Let tomorrow sort tomorrow's problems out. We've got to get started. And they said, go ahead.
Norman Foster and the Bean Hill houses, built utilising fabrication techniques that were state of the art. Well, I remember Fred coming back from opening of Bean Hill 1, I think it was Bean Hill 1, and he pulled me and David Newman in. David Newman was the landscape architect working in South Milton Keynes, and said, the main access into the city at the moment is currently V7 from Bletchley. It goes right past Bean Hill 1. Earth-shaping and obliterate it, he said. I don't want this to be the first vision of Milton Keynes that visitors see. So off we went, found the necessary spoil, put in the earth mountings and planted it. And you can't see Bean Hill 1 from V7 or H9 to this day. Now, I think Fred was beginning to feel let down by his old profession about what they were producing. They didn't seem to be able to relate to the realities of building a new community in a real life political situation where he had the potential of being vilified. Well, he was, wasn't he? I mean, what is it? There is a Bean Hill far away. What was it? There is a Bean Hill far away without a city wall, where Fred Lloyd Roach was crucified. La 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 la.
Whilst large-scale, system-built, flat-roofed housing schemes using non-traditional materials were being constructed in the south of Milton Keynes, in the north of Milton Keynes a different approach was being taken.
We weren't proud of the early work that had been done. And we knew we could do better than that. But the stuff that we were producing had been under pressure, system-built stuff to produce numbers. We were better than that. Subsequently, later, we got to know a lot more about what was needed. I said in our team, we are going to build in traditional brick and tile. We are sitting on the largest deposits of natural brick in the UK, just across in Bedfordshire. It's cheap, it's available, and we're going to build in brick and tile and timber. And that's it. That's going to be our palette. And we began to experiment and do smaller things. And in Great Linford, for instance, we implemented this idea of small groups, a variety of architects. Each was given a little jewel to design, and they all designed little jewels, and it was highly successful. We were now getting to the mix of public housing, private housing, more or less the same kinds of designs, cheek by jowl, so you couldn't tell the difference whether it was rented or private. And that was, we felt, the best kind of environment that we could get to. You could walk around those spaces on the drawing board, whereas the larger scale schemes, people were just looking at patterns.
I started at Milton Keynes, if I can remember, and bear in mind it's 40 odd years ago, I think it was something like 71, 72. At the time, there was, I think, only 6 houses had been built, 6 or 8 houses being built. I used to go to the technical offices of new towns, and certainly with the butt of all the jokes at the time, and I kept saying, you see, you'll see. And I must say, the time when Milton Keynes was building 3,000 houses a year, now that's a lot of houses, when they were building 3,000 houses a year, I did enjoy going back and saying to them, just 3,000 this year. And if you'll stop and think about it, there's about 300 working days in a year. That meant it was 10 houses every day. It's more than one every working hour. You've got somebody in London packing the furniture into a van, you'd somebody halfway up the M1 and you'd somebody up here unpacking into a new home. It was a tremendous time.
With the completion of the first new housing estates came the arrival of the pioneer families. One of the things that distinguished the plan for Milton Keynes was the heavy emphasis put on social development. The Development Corporation helped people settle into their new houses and create local community groups. Corporation staff also encouraged and enabled the development of sports, the arts and the voluntary sector.
We've got French windows out as well into the back garden, and this one's quite large. And you have a storage place outside for your...
Decided on arrivals workers coming in who were to meet the new people. We wanted to give the new residents every opportunity when they come here to settle in free of any worries or so on. I thought the settling in went very well indeed, and our arrivals workers did a good job in visiting every household twice in the first 3 months. That was the theory, and they were very helpful.
Apart from the arrivals visitors, we had a community worker who would cover a larger area, and that we would use the community house for new groups setting up. So if people wanted to set up a luncheon club for the elderly or a play group or whatever it is, they would meet there. So they didn't have to meet in their houses, they could meet into something that was independent. Because I think sometimes people are a bit wary of asking people into their homes.
My job, I came to be the Arts and Cultural Development Officer, and I realised that all the things I cared about on a personal level, which was make the arts available to the 99% of the population, meant that we had to do things differently. The one part of the master plan that really bothered me, that they only talked about, yes, in the city centre there will be a museum and an art gallery and a big theatre and all of that. And quite frankly, I knew that that would come along at the right time. What wouldn't come along at the right time is the growth from the grassroots level. And when I, said to Jock Campbell, he asked me the question, what do you think is the most important thing? And I said, back people, not buildings. And I gave my all to making sure that it was for everybody.
The master plan said that in Milton Keynes, landscape would be an all-pervading feature in every facet of its development, whether it was industrial, commercial or housing. It did not specify just how much land this would take up.
I had suggested the idea of Forest City, and this went down extremely well with the board. We wanted a parkland system, and I suggested a parkland system to the board, which looked at two things. One was a maximum and one was a minimum. And much to my absolutely joy, the board went for the maximum. And the maximum was 20% of the landscape of the city.
Well, as we see the city today and its landscape, undoubtedly the biggest single factor to getting it there was Fred Roach. I can remember him early on saying, we will never have the resources to build beautiful buildings, the likes of which are enjoyed by Florence or Venice. If the city is going to be a success, it is going to be its landscape and the trees. And you arrive at Milton Keynes having got the job, I think I was called Forestry and Conservation Officer. to produce the City of Trees. Now, meanwhile, Neil Hickson, my colleague at Runcorn, I knew he too was being offered similar terms to go to Milton Keynes.
The interview was with Derek Walker and Fred. I don't think anyone else, just those two. And Tony Southard was another person being interviewed. And Derek desperately wanted Tony. Tony was an architect, planner and landscape architect. And I was just a peasant gardener, really. And Fred wanted me and Derek wanted Tony. So Fred said, oh, we'll have both of them at the same level and we'll divide the town according to however they want to divide the responsibility.
And Neil declined. The job was offered him, but he declined. And so I came to Milton Keynes without my mate, really. And it was difficult in those days because the Walker-Southard way of doing things was a lot different to what I'd been doing with Neil in Runcorn. Andrew Mahady had done these wonderful drawings of what the grid roads were going to look like in 80 years' time, and there was the vision for the grid roads. And Tony was very much for having this zonation of trees so that he believed that people would be able to identify where they were in the city by the nature of the trees that they were travelling through at that time. So to give an example, the south east of the city was to be predominantly cherry and oak. I was unhappy with this, but on the other hand, I'm not a designer, I'm a grower and a manager.
I kept getting invitations to Fred's house to talk about problems beyond, and he then started applying pressure for me to come in and organise the central landscape unit. The principal argument was that we can attract people down to Milton Keynes, but as soon as they bring their wives down here and families at the weekends, they drop out because it's such an appalling place. I felt at the time that landscape was a poor relation. It was conceived by architects and not really by with any kind of fundamental realisation that the landscape of a city is the great labyrinth of freedom, where young people, old people, weird people can wander and be themselves and not be confined and controlled by these four walls, so to speak.
Neil thought visually. So he would plant things at the front and put oak trees at the back on the basis that eventually you can cut away at the front, the oak trees will have grown. He planted things very closely together so they all fought for the light. He thought in colour, he thought in leaf size, he thought in seasons. Derek didn't do that. It was left to Neil to knit it all together.
Sometimes it was necessary to go a little bit beyond the defined financial limits to achieve success. The chief quantity surveyor, who was Frank Henshaw, who took over from Fred as general manager, he was upset by my maverick behaviour in relation to money. And I was called down and Frank and Fred were there, and Frank said, "He's done it again. He's overrun on this." And my rather nervous and stupid answer was it's the only way I've managed to achieve worthwhile things, so I've done it. I'd hardly got any words out of my mouth when I saw this kind of flicker in Fred's eyes. And he said, "Frank, he's answered it. Thank you, Neil." So off I went with a kind of reassurance that I could do it again.
The Tree Cathedral was an amazing project which had very little to do with me. This seemed to be something that got dreamed up between Neil and Frank Henshaw.
I can tell you where the idea came from, because I was coming back from a meeting in Aylesbury and I drove past, there is a tree cathedral north of Aylesbury. I just saw this notice and I thought, bloody hell, you know, that's what, we've got the city of trees, it needs a cathedral. I want to pay some respect to Frank Henshaw, you know, because he battled with my bad behaviour fairly consistently over the years, from Runcorn to MK, and one stage towards the end he rang me up and said, you know, come down to the tower. And I went down. I thought, oh shit, what have I done now? And he just said, I always thought that Fred's belief in you and landscape was just in the eye of the believer. But I'd like to say that I think you've done a very important job.
And he was right. Absolutely right.
But he's a great man to say that.
The centre of Milton Keynes is the highest spot of the designated area. In 1967 it was a bleak, wind-swept bean field. The challenge was to transform this into the bustling heart of a new city, now visited by upwards of 30 million people a year.
Derek Walker, whom I'd known before I studied architecture in London, rang me one day to say that he'd been given the job of chief architect and planner at Milton Keynes, and I said, where's that? And he explained, and then said, would you be interested in joining me? And I said, well, it depends. What to do what? And he said, what? How do you like to design a new city centre? Well, that didn't take very long time, sir.
4 of us in the room, Stuart in charge, and I've forgotten how we actually started. I think we read the master plan a lot.
There were quite intense conversations about how the green books were our Bible. When we were stuck, we didn't think of an idea, someone would read the green book out and open it up and read the paragraph that described the city centre.
The centre in the master plan was, I don't know, if you include the park, it's about 3.5 kilometres by 1 kilometre. Our first job really was to set the pattern of roads and infrastructure in the city centre, and then to design buildings that would fit into that framework of infrastructure.
We started making diagrams. These are the grid roads. We drew it as a diagram, we ironing out the kinks, and then we built it like that. In the master plan, these are all waving about. So we said this is a diagram.
It started as a series of diagrams. 3 boulevards, 4 boulevards, 2 boulevards. We draw the versions. We drew perimeter car parking or car parking in courtyards.
It is worth remembering that all of these alternative plans were drawn laboriously by hand on paper, This was long before the advent of computer-aided design.
So that's what we were doing in the early days. Before then, we had established the infrastructure to the point where the board had agreed that that's the basis upon which we would then work. Then you get to designing buildings.
It did take a long time. We spent probably a year doing diagrams.
And at that stage, the infrastructure is fully worked out by Ken Baker, working with the engineers, all in quite some detail. But at the same time this was going on, Stuart, Sid Green and I were working on the shopping. I was starting to work on what turned out to be the shopping.
We are all influenced by, a million and one things, but the two principal influences, the work of the German architect Mies van der Rohe and the way in which he approached architecture was interesting to several of us. The second influence was European 19th century buildings with the use of cast iron and glass. And what they provided was weather-protected areas of city centres which people could enjoy and which they could shop in or eat in or take a coffee or whatever. That was the other big influence.
The corporation had engaged the services of private consultants who were experts in retailing, and Healy and Baker were the first of these. And the suggestion was made that perhaps a first phase of 1/3 square feet, see how it goes, and then, if it goes well, then do a similar second phase, and so on.
Well, that was, at the time, sound, sensible, predictable commercial advice that was presented to the board and to Lord Campbell and to Fred Roach, who rejected it, so far as I could see, out of hand. It is not the Milton Keynes style. We're going to hit the marketplace between the eyes. We're going to get on with it and do it and make it work. And by God, weren't they right?
Partnership funding from the private sector was obtained from the Post Office Pension Fund, and the construction of the shopping building started.
You have to remember the other stuff that was being built in this country at around the same time, the Arndale centres and so on. They were not all that pleasant a place to be in. Contrast that with central Milton Keynes, with these high arcades, naturally lit. They were airy, they let in the sunlight. It was such a contrast to the other things that were being built in this country at that time.
It was only when the building came out of the ground that I realised that it was, and still is in my view, a masterpiece.
We knew it was a big scheme, but we didn't think it could fail. And part of that was getting people like John Lewis to commit at an early stage, and we would have liked Marks and Spencer to come in as another of the anchors at an early stage, and that they resolutely refused to do.
Marks and Spencer's did not have a policy of opening many new stores. We had no population here at the time to talk of. They did have a store in Bedford. They did have a store in Northampton. They did have a store in Oxford. They did have a store in Aylesbury. That encircled Milton Keynes. So no, they wouldn't sign up to it. They would need a lot of persuasion. That was enough for me, and I have to say our colleague David Crew at the time, who was Director of Information, for us to arrange to reserve a site for Marks and Spencer's. They were very upset about this. They said they had not reserved the site in Milton Keynes. And I told them, no, I know they hadn't, but I had. There was a man called Roger Aldridge. He was he was not happy, but they were hard luck. What really offended him, this wasn't me, this was David Crew, was he organised the sign that went round it, and of course he did it in Marks and Spencer's logo and style. So it looked very much as though it was a Marks and Spencer sign. But, we went ahead and let the rest of the centre. John Lewis's signed up, they were fitting out, there was all sorts of commitments going on. And at the 11th hour, Marks and Spencer's began to think, I think they never admitted this, oh dear, we've made a mistake, maybe we should be there. So they got in touch and said, okay, well, they'd like to explore the possibility of taking a small store that might grow with the population of Milton Keynes. Well, we didn't have a small store, we only had the one that we'd reserved for them, and that was too big for them. Anyway, they took the store, they fitted it out, and they said because it was too big for them, they were going to partition off a substantial area on the ground floor to reduce the amount of retail space, and they would use the upper floor entirely for storage and staff accommodation. And that's what they did. And they opened the store in time for Christmas, sometime about this time of year in November. And they were overwhelmed, absolutely overwhelmed. And before Christmas, they removed all the partitions on the ground floor and expanded into the total space available. And of course, ironically, they were the first major retailer to relocate out into a much, much bigger store when the shopping centre was extended.
The Queen visited Milton Keynes with Prince Philip in 1979, shortly before the shopping centre opened. She was met at one of the entrances to the shopping centre by Stuart Moscrop and myself, and then we escorted them through into Middleton Hall, and that was a great experience. It was full of cheering, waving school children, all with their little flags. I think the Queen's visit took place in June or July 79, and in September Mrs Thatcher did the official opening of the shopping building, and Dennis was with her, and when it was time for the Thatchers to leave, we all stood outside, and it was a beautiful sunny day, the sky was blue, the sun was shining, the shopping building was reflecting all of this and the clouds, and we had earlier described what had gone into the making of the shopping building, and how the Development Corporation had been the developer, had taken the risk, but how good it was that so many private investors had come in and know all that they had done and so on. And just as the limousine drew up for the Thatchers, and just as Dennis was about to get in, he shook hands with Fred and he shook hands with me, and he said, "Isn't the private sector wonderful?"
You've never seen anywhere like it. Central Milton Keynes. You've never been anywhere.
And then it opened. And of course it was flooded with people. People came from all over. Coaches, 3-hour journeys down the motorway to come and visit this new shopping centre. Hugely successful from day one.
I thought, first of all, we were mad to build it so big in the first phase. I didn't think we'd get away with it, and even when it opened, I took my whole family and gave them £5 each, because I thought we'd be the only people there.
Central Milton Keynes, shopping as it should be.
Junction 14, just off the M1.
Once the infrastructure was in place, developing Milton Keynes was a constant balancing act. On the one hand, there had to be enough jobs for the incoming population to be employed in. On the other hand, there had to be enough new accommodation to house the workers of any firm that decided to relocate. This delicate housing-jobs balance was always difficult to get right. When it was not right, protests would ensue. as they did in the very early days of the Development Corporation, when there were not enough houses being built to cater for the demand from industrialists. As with other aspects of the corporation's work, the task of negotiating the deals and relocating firms was entrusted to a young staff.
I remember very, very well doing the Abbey National deal. I got the Abbey National people in. We're trying to do a deal for CMK. I get as far as I can with the negotiation. They ain't budging anymore. I think there's a little bit more to be squeezed. And I think to myself, this might be a time just to touch base with the boss. So I trundled along the corridor, and Fred was in his office as it happened. He might not have been. Went in, I said, look, I'm in the middle of this discussion with Abbey National. I'm pushing them as far as I can. They don't really want to go any further. Have you got a view? He said, yeah, ever so simple. Do the best you can. Don't lose them. Okay? And that was it. That was the instruction. And I think in a way that just summed up Fred's approach, the corporation's approach actually. And Abbey National came, and then they extended and went up to about over 4,000 people working in Milton Keynes, because they took on a massive site at Shenley Wood as well. So for the corporation and job growth, it was brilliant.
The search for firms to come to Milton Keynes was not just confined to the United Kingdom. The corporation had a presence in Scandinavia and Germany, and agents in the United States and Japan, all of them targeting firms. However, this search for inward investment was not at any cost.
We had the visit of Mortensen from EDS in the States. A massive IT company, absolutely incredible IT company, and to have won that for Milton Keynes would have been awesome. They flew in one day to our heliport, and we met with them and did the tour around. And they finished up by saying, we love Milton Keynes, we want to come to Milton Keynes, and we want that. And what that was the whole of Campbell Park. EDS wanted to do Texas in Milton Keynes. They wanted the whole of Campbell Park. And we said, no. As much as we'd love your IT jobs, and as much as it would impress the whole world to have you here, no. The planning for Milton Keynes and the integrity of that plan was far more important to us than being seduced by your offer. We didn't put it quite like that, but that was the bottom line. And I think that was brilliant.
Attracting both inward investment and potential residents was an issue from the early days of Milton Keynes, when most people in the country either hadn't heard of it, or if they had, it was being made fun of on the radio.
We had early on a 6-week exhibition at the Design Centre in London at the Haymarket. And this was very, very important because a lot of people were tepid about Milton Keynes. The construction industry didn't really think it was going to happen. The city gents thought it was a bit dubious, and it was just another of those sort of socialist new towns that weren't going to work terribly well. And what was interesting is that we signed up something like 110 people from that 6-week exhibition. So Alan Ashton, who was the chief estates guy then had a whale of a time.
I remember going to the first design centre one, and there was a sort of woolly sheep in the middle that barred at you when you went in, and I'm thinking, what investor's going to come in here and be impressed by that? But I think on reflection that these were all important elements of getting Milton Keynes on the map.
There's a poster made by Philip Castle. That poster surrounded a wonderful silver model of the sewage works. And I'd coined this terrific phrase, which was that if we do this for shit, think what we do for people, you see. And Jock was informed that Derek was going to do this, and Jock came down to London in his car from Nettlebed, and he, where's Derek? He said, Derek, you can't put it on. You can't put it on. It's vulgar. Said Jock, I wasn't going to put it on. I just thought it'd be a great idea. He said, it is a great idea. It's also a great idea you're not putting it on. So I said, but it is true.
The marketing of Milton Keynes continued into the 80s, mainly in the form of poster campaigns and print journalism. The most memorable used wit to get people to take notice of the new city.
Cogent Elliott, our advertising agents, came in to see me with this proposal to run a TV ad at these really good deal rates, and it was the Red Balloon. And basically, it was a story of that was borrowed from the French film that showed the story of a little chap carrying a red balloon around different parts of Milton Keynes and then ending up in the bowl where the red balloon race of Milton Keynes was being held. And today, this was done in '83, so today, 33 years on, it still gives me a shiver up the spine to watch that last bit where the little lad comes up the steps and goes over the top into the bowl.
Wouldn't it be nice if all cities were like Milton Keynes?
This has been the story of the people who decades ago helped create the framework, the skeleton of a new city. But it's the citizens who have chosen to come and make a new life in Milton Keynes, who have given the city its character and soul. They took the risk of leaving family and friends behind to make a new life in what was initially a raw and barren place. But they have been able to write their own history in a way that few others in more established places ever get the chance to do. The story of just how that happened is the subject of another film. But the positive can-do attitude that outsiders say characterises Milton Keynes today can surely be traced back to those who joined the Milton Keynes Development Corporation in those early days.
I think that we've done wrong things. Every huge enterprise has got warts on it. My own view of what Milton Keynes can be like is it can be like what Britain should be like. I think that by the end of the century it can be one of the most exciting things that happened in this country this century.
I'm part of a generation which started work soon after World War II and includes those ex-servicemen who had wartime service but were still young when they came back, who had a great ambition to improve things in this country, to build a better Britain. So it was in that spirit again that the new towns started, and I think it's why we were able to attract so many talented people.
I was proud to be part of the Milton Keynes thing. I am proud of it. Nobody who wasn't there doesn't understand the energy and the idealism and the hopes and expectations that we were all putting together. It was an incredible time. Milton Keynes became something out of the energy of the 70s that was really unique and special.
It was the atmosphere created from the chairman through its chief exec, Fred Roach, right the way through the organisation, and I don't recall ever dealing with anyone that did not regard themselves as part of the team.
The enthusiasm in the corporation with members of staff from the 1970s, the commitment, as far as I was concerned, was fascinating. I'd never worked in an organisation where there was such commitment and optimism.
I think for many the pressure and commitment that everybody had to me was very stressful. A lot of marriages broke up because of that, because of the commitment to work late. If it needed you to work late, you stayed and did it. If it needed you to work weekends, you did it. I think that was, in a way, was the loyalty to people like Fred, that they thought that was what we did. We were here to do it, not to talk about it, not to just pontificate on how things should be.
Milton Keynes is not yet fully recognised for what it has achieved, and is certainly still, in many ways, reviled for what it has achieved. That hurts. I think the reason is that it is because it is a fundamentally socialist philosophy, the one of the corporate good, corporate benefit, rather than the realisation of personal success. Milton Keynes was essentially a public initiative which has worked.
It wasn't an easy job, and it wasn't just me. We were all working our guts out, and I reckon that in the end it's been worth it. We've produced a city where people want to live. I mean, that's what I discover when I talk to people. Why are you, why do you want to live in Milton Keynes? And they tell me. They tell me because they like it here.
I think it's a time for people, and I think people, to some extent, feel that. It's roughly worked as we intended it to. And I think it will become a great city. I mean, no doubt about this at all.
Building a new city over this period of time in a greenfield site is partly a pioneering task. And what would be marvellous is if people of Milton Keynes, and one could feel sort of little signs of this, could actually feel a pride in their city, because it is their city. It's not Bill's or Bob's or anybody around here or mine or Jock Campbell's. It's their city.